Class is now in session. I'm Professor Hockey, and today we're discussing Game 81 of the regular season between the San Jose Sharks and the Edmonton Oilers, in which the Sharks have lost 5-4 in overtime. The San Jose Sharks came into this game 0-3 against the Oilers throughout this season, with a risk of going 0-4, losing every single game to the Oilers for the first time ever. Now, this isn't necessarily insanely surprising because of how bad the Oilers have been as of late. For most of the 2010s, the Oilers were a basement-dwelling team, so the Sharks managing to get even a single win against them was more or less guaranteed. But we also have to recall, back in the early days of the San Jose Sharks, back in the 90s, the Sharks were not good at all. The expansion draft was not nearly as favorable as it was to the Golden Knights and the Seattle Kraken recently. Back in the day, you basically tried to scrape together a bunch of third and fourth liners and hoped for the best at that point, so the expansion team was not going to be good right out of the gate. And so the fact that the Oilers never got the season series sweep then is relatively surprising. And yet here with this season, with this loss here tonight against the Oilers, they go 0-4, which I thought was a pretty interesting stats. However, going into this game, the Sharks, they actually played rather well. It's kind of disappointing from their perspective that they actually ended up losing this game. In fact, the loss in overtime is even double worse because they don't get the good feelings of actually being able to get the victory and, carrying into that to the end of the season, but they also still managed to get a single point in the standings, which isn't going to help their lottery chances, of course, either. Now, this one starts off rather well for the San Jose Sharks. In the first period, they get not one but two goals from Noah Gregor within about 30 seconds of each other to give them the early 2-0 lead. And these weren't just two goals that happened to come in the middle of Edmonton Oilers possession or anything like that. No, the Sharks were the better team. You could even argue the significantly better team in that first period, and they were rewarded for that effort with these two goals. And so it looked like going into this first intermission that the Sharks were quite set to do well in this game. But in the second period, even though the Sharks were still outplaying the Oilers, it was the Oilers who managed to capitalize on their few chances. And while the chances for the Oilers were indeed few and far between, the chances that they did get were extremely dangerous. First one by McLeod came after a mad scramble in front of the Sharks net with the first power play unit for the Oilers, where they just came inches from actually scoring a goal. And then they would manage to tie the game up at 2, which would be a theme for tonight for the Oilers, and they'd get 3 game-tying goals throughout this one. Eventually, it would be Scott Reedy who continues his mini-hot streak as well, who would put the Sharks back into the lead, and that would be the score at the end of the second period, 3-2 lead for the Sharks. So while their lead did shrink from 2 to 1 goals, they were still in a solid position to win this game. And in the third period, once again, which was the theme of the game, the Sharks were playing pretty well, but the Oilers outscored them in that final frame. They would tie the game up at 3 before the Sharks' Nick Bonino later on would make it 4-3, get the lead back, and the Oilers would tie it yet again 4-4, and we would head to overtime, where of course we know the Sharks are absolutely terrible in the overtime. And when you combine it with the fact that the Oilers are able to ice, the best player in the league, and then a top 5, maybe even top 3 player in the league with Connor McDavid and Leon Draisaitl respectively, you're not going to really have a very good combination there. And so it was no surprise that the Oilers were the team that were getting the majority of the chances. McDavid stayed on the ice for a good minute and a half early in this overtime, and yet he still had the energy to go end to end pretty much. Had a breakaway that Reimer had to make a big save on. Then there was a 2-on-1 that Ferraro had to make a miraculous diving poke check play to poke the puck off of his stick. But eventually Noah Gregor comes out on the ice. Not the worst decision in the world, since the Sharks don't really need to win this game, and he did score 2 goals and played really generally quite well. But Gregor just abandons his defensive assignment, overloads one side of the ice way too much, doesn't communicate with Brent Burns that he's going to be making this play, and so when all of the Sharks players converge onto just the one Oiler, Nugent Hopkins, he is able to just feed a pass right through to Hyman, who is completely and utterly all alone. He's able to beat Reimer, unsurprisingly, since Reimer has to slide across to a player who's completely uncovered, and Reimer is of course letting his frustrations known by breaking his stick across the post at the end of this game, probably not so happy with the fact that his team left him completely out to dry in that overtime frame, even though we were only a couple of minutes in, and as such, the Sharks lose it 5-4, like I said. On to the players to talk about. Generally, it was actually a very positive game for every single one of the Sharks, or almost, I should say, every single one of the Sharks forwards. None of these players necessarily had all that bad of a game. When it comes to this first line, Meyer, Hertl, and Barabanov, they had a lot of good chances. If there's one thing I was actually somewhat disappointed by, is that there were multiple occasions where Hertl, in particular, had great opportunities to really make a nice play, either take a good shot or try and feed the correct pass, and this was coming down the left side most of the time, at least from the TV angle, and this happened a good 3-4 times in this game, which is kind of surprising that happened so many times. And it felt as though each and every time he just wasn't necessarily making that correct choice. And so I think only one of them actually ended up with a dangerous chance on net. So while this line was clearly generating opportunities, clearly finding space on the ice, the reason why they didn't actually end up getting a goal here tonight is because they just weren't making that last final decision to be able to finish off those chances and convert them into goals. On the second line, we have Bonino, Couture, and Nieto, which continues to be a very surprising, solid second line for the San Jose Sharks. And there was a very interesting post-game comment coming from Bob Booner at the end of this one, which that he would consider playing Bonino full-time as a winger going into next season, since, of course, Bonino does have 1 year left on his contract. But this is kind of an interesting choice, because I seem to recall, maybe I'm wrong about this, and maybe my memory is off, but I seem to recall early on this season, in the first couple of months, that Bonino had at a point got put up to the first line winger for the San Jose Sharks because of certain injuries, and then once he was moved back to the center position, it was stated, I don't know if directly by Bonino or if by Booner coming from Bonino, that Bonino didn't really want to come to the San Jose Sharks to play on the wing, and yet as of late he's been playing on the wing with Couture, and he has not only been perfectly fine with it, at least from what we can tell from the outside, but he's also been excelling in this particular position. So I definitely cannot blame Booner for wanting to play Bonino on the wing, especially with the emergence of Thomas Bordeleau, who I will get to a bit later. But I was just kind of surprised because, of course, at least I remembered Bonino saying that he didn't really want to play this particular position. When it comes to the Sharks' third line, once again, very impressive. At the very least, the duo of Bordeleau and Gregor. Gregor continues to shine given this type of chemistry that he has found on the third line. Remember, Gregor was the player who was just like the biggest, I don't want to say joke, but it was kind of a running gag, I guess you could say, on the San Jose Sharks, where the guy was good for a good 1 or 2 very solid grade A chances per game, and yet he was never going to actually be able to score on them, was sitting at like 2 or 3 goals for a very, very long time, because even when he was getting breakaway after breakaway, 2-on-1 after 2-on-1, tap-in type of goals, he was just somehow not able to score on them. And yet ever since he has been joined on his line by Thomas Bordeleau, things have just absolutely opened up for Gregor, and he's not only getting set up for obviously fantastic chances, but he's also getting better shots off like we saw with his first goal, and even a bit of better puck luck like we saw with his second goal. So obviously a lot of credit does go to Gregor, but a lot of credit does also have to go to Bordeleau, who I will talk about a bit here, who once again had a pretty impressive game. Maybe the major thing about Bordeleau, obviously, over these past few games that he has played, has been just the elite, well, maybe not elite, but the exceptional skill that he has shown, which is a very big deal, because that's one of the few things, that you can't actually teach to a player, which is just that innate talent, right? A player comes in and they're not very good defensively, well, you can teach them how to be better. They're not very good positionally, you can teach them how to be better. Even if they're not very good, let's say, skating-wise, you could get them to work on that during an entire offseason. But when it comes to just general innate talent, you can't just say, hey, get better at the game, because that just doesn't really work. And so Bordeleau being able to step into the NHL level on this third line and actually show up and make these fantastic plays. We saw him pick off that pass, a very nice read onto Duncan Keith, an extremely veteran Oilers defenseman who has 3 Stanley Cup rings to his name. The fact that he's able to read that play so well, pick off that pass, and then set up Gregor. Yes, obviously the Gregor goal ended up being a lucky one that gives Bordeleau the assist here tonight. It was still a very, very nice play. And so the fact that he comes in, he shows off this skill means very, very good things compared to, let's say, let's say a different player were to come in but be very good defensively, just not really have that much skill to his game, you would probably only project him to ever really be a bottom six player, a fourth line player, because he just didn't really have that high end talent. Bordeleau does have that high end talent, and that means good things for the Sharks moving forward. Finally, I do have to discuss the fourth line as well. Reedy, Shemilevsky, and Gadjevich comes in. This line actually had a couple of very solid shifts. Reedy continues to be a very solid force on the power play as a net front presence. He's kind of in the same role that earlier on in this season that Jasper Weatherby was in, but Weatherby wasn't necessarily doing that great of a job. He was okay, but not that great of a job. He was kind of just a big body in front, but couldn't necessarily clean up the garbage type of goals. But Reedy has been doing a very good job, not necessarily getting garbage type of goals that hit off of his leg or anything like that, but his hand-eye coordination is actually rather impressive. So it's definitely good to see that he's been able to fit into that role. And so as long as he can do something like that, keeping him on the fourth line, even if he's not necessarily excelling at the even strength level, is definitely a good choice. On to the defensive side of things, it was a pretty good game defensively for the San Jose Sharks. Like I say, there were a few cracks in the armor for the Sharks because of the fact that there was just the occasional time where an Oiler would break through and have a marvelous chance for themselves. But then that's probably going to happen when you're facing off against a team that features McDavid and Draisaitl. So the fact that they weren't completely dominated, they weren't getting very significant offensive zone shifts, the Oilers were, it is a testament to the Sharks playing rather well. In particular, Burns and Ferraro have been finishing this year off quite well, which is nice to see because it was a pairing that started the season together, never really looked good, so the Sharks kind of had to separate them at the midway point. If they can find that chemistry once again, it's nice to see that could be a consistent pair for the Sharks, though of course Burns is aging and we'll see how long he can actually remain as a top defenseman. It was already looking very shaky at times this season, though he has brought it back as of late. We'll see what happens. When it comes to the other four defensemen, of course, the usual, I do want to talk a bit about Merkley, who again I thought was making some very smart choices offensively. He drew a penalty on, public enemy number one, Evander Kane. I believe it was in the second period, if I'm not mistaken. And I think that was also the Sharks' first power play of the entire game at that point, which was semi-surprising, but that's I won't even get into that. So I thought Merkley actually played rather well. When it comes to the goaltender, James Reimer, he did let in 4 goals here tonight, but compared to the 4 goals that Kaapo Kähkönen let in the previous one, I definitely am not really blaming Reimer on many of these. I feel as though Reimer was, in a way, let out to dry in this game because while the Sharks played generally a solid defensive game, they did have a few too many breakdowns that Reimer had to come up with big saves on, and he did multiple times, like we saw in the overtime, but eventually goals are going to go in, and while 4 isn't a great look, I still think Reimer played pretty well. But that will do it for this review. The Sharks will be back in action one final time this season where they will take on the NHL's 32nd team, the Seattle Kraken. It probably won't be a very good game. The Kraken are a team that are even worse than the San Jose Sharks, but still watch as it'll be the last bit of Sharks hockey that we will see for a while. Class dismissed.